Being a professional isn't about the money you make, the position you hold, your level of expertise, or fame. It's the motivation and the attitude you bring to your work. A desire for always learning and improving, and balancing your creative output with getting the business done. Welcome and join the Creating Pros. Hi, and welcome back to Creating Pros. I'm your host, Jim Nettles. And this week I finally dug in a friend to do a show we've been trying to do for, a year, something like that. Something like that. So, Anna, do you want to kind of introduce yourself and all the different stuff you're in the middle of, and then we'll sort of dive into this one?
Hey, yes. Well, thank you so much for having me, Jim. I'm really excited we finally got to do this. Yes, I am Anna Bartolucci. I'm a clinical psychologist and behavioral sleep medicine specialist. So by day, I help people sleep without drugs. And by night, I have a not so secret other life as Cecelia Dominic, USA Today bestselling steampunk and urban fantasy author. When I introduce myself at conventions, I say that my books keep readers turning the pages all night. So is it a conflict of interest or a business plan? Up to you. And I have recently combined my two loves of creativity and psychology into Psych Up Academy. So online courses and coaching to help high achievers get out of their own way and fulfill their creative dreams.
So, we've been talking about this for a while because I think it's not the worst kept secret in the industry, but pretty close that, sleep and I are not necessarily always the best of friends. That I tend to not sleep a whole lot to start with. But I've kind of always been that way. It's not a matter of insomnia or anything like that. It's just, okay, I get my 4 or 5 in and let it roll.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see in terms of how does sleep impact just in general creativity, productivity, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship. But first, one thing that you mentioned is that, okay, so you're what we would call a short sleeper, which, some of us might consider that a lucky thing to do because honestly, I need 8 or 9. And my husband, interestingly, he's probably more of like a 7-hour sleeper. And so if he sleeps my schedule, like when we travel, he will often have insomnia after the 3rd or 4th night because he's been sleeping too much and has a surplus. So it is possible for that to happen. But of course, people have read a certain book by a certain colleague of mine called Why We Sleep, and they get completely freaked out that if they don't get 8 hours of sleep every night, they're going to stop functioning, develop dementia, and die tomorrow. So yeah, I like to make sure that people know that, okay, so the NIH, National Institute for Health, recommends that adults get between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. Some people can sleep safely, outside of that. It's a bell curve. There are tails. So, I have had a lot of patients who have developed insomnia because they have been spending more time in bed trying to get those 8 hours of sleep that they are not capable of. So yeah, that can definitely lead to issues. In your case, you would probably also say, well, you might want to talk to a sleep specialist just in case, because 4 to 5 hours really is below normal. But I mean, I don't know that I have ever known you to do anything normally. So there's that. And
my species has not come back to pick me back up and take me home yet. I don't know what to tell you about that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, basically I'll run on, I do need more now. And I mean, post plague, that's one of those things I can say is I do need more than I used to. And also getting a little older, I need more than I used to, but it's also not uncommon for me to be able to go and run on my 4 or 5. Then I'll sleep for a day or two where it's okay. I get my 7 or 8 and then I can go back to my normal sort of schedule. But it's also not uncommon for me to get up in the middle of the night and go work on something for a bit and then go back to bed or whatever else. So
yeah, it sounds like you manage. So that's good.
So we'll see when I go crazy or lose the sanity I have. But
there you go.
Normal human being.
Yes. But then as for sleep and creativity, I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize until they're trying to do something creative is just how much in terms of mental resources that creativity does require. I mean, yes, it's fun. Yes, it's relaxing, but it still requires things like focus, and it requires I don't really like the word discipline, but it requires being able to make yourself sit down and at least get started, which is where a lot of people get tripped up. So, if you're sleeping, if you have a well-rested brain, you're better able to do those things. You're also able to make those interesting connections that are so important for creativity because the mind is in a better problem solving space. And I think another interesting thing that a lot of people don't think about is that, you know, creativity, we need to both use our emotions, but then also get out of our way in a sense, or get the emotions out of the way, like the imposter syndrome and the things that come up with that. And so sleep also helps us to better put things in perspective. And that's because the brain is an organ just like a lot of other things. It just happens to be like a massive jello organ, but it's, it needs its rest just like everything else.
So I'm going to throw a fun question out there because I know that this is actually a large kind of internal debate. What is sleep?
Ah, well, that's Timothy Mouse's answer. Um, yeah, when I do my trainings on sleep, we start off with, yeah, we haven't really got a good definition. So we know that it's different from being awake. We know that it's not the same thing as being in a coma. It's a state of being somewhat disconnected from the outside world. And it's not necessarily that the brain is less active, it's differently active. And so you might get less activity in like the frontal lobes, that part of the brain that, is what kind of makes us human, but, animals have as well. And we end up with more activity in like the other, like the quote unquote, more primitive parts of the brain as we are working through stuff. But of course, that also depends on the stages of sleep too. So we just know that it's different. Brain waves of sleep look different from brain waves of being awake. Brain imaging of sleep looks different from brain imaging of being awake. We basically know that bad things happen if we don't get enough of it. But yeah, that's really, really hard to pin down a good definition.
So this is one of those things because again, I've always had an interesting, tenuous relationship with sleep. Where I'm one of those people, I don't really like to sleep. It's one of those things of I recognize it as a necessity, whereas my spouse loves sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And as she's getting older, she's needing less of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you guys even talked about that a little bit when we were Dragon Con. But looking at it and looking at how different friends of mine react different ways, looking at different things I've done professionally over the years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've never exactly run on what most people would consider a normal schedule just by all the various things I've done. When we look at and think about the idea of sleep and productivity, again, it's do you have whatever it takes to run optimally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having certain levels of sleep, certain levels of rest definitely is a factor in running optimally. I can tell definitively when I am and when I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of your practice, when you're working with patients, when you're working through that process, what does that look like for you? And what are you looking for to tell whether or not somebody is in that right space or not?
Yeah, that's a good question because, when people come to my office, to my practice, basically what they want me to do is make them be able to fall asleep within 5 minutes of their heads hitting the pillow and then sleep for 8 hours straight and then wake up feeling ready to take on the world. And, that's not usually where we end up because of course, different people need different amounts of sleep. It's normal for adults to wake up during the night. The hope is that you wake up and then it's brief and you go back to sleep. And we all need different amounts of sleep on different nights. And so we'll often get to a point of asking, okay, well, let's say you're getting 7 hours of sleep and it doesn't really look your body needs anymore. It's not allowing you to get any more. So how are you feeling during the day? How are you functioning? How are you focusing? And that's more what you're getting to is like, yeah, that is more of the optimal state.
So, what are the main reasons that people actually would come and talk to you, right? In terms of this idea, what are kind of some of the common sort of sleep problems? Who's coming to you? What are the issues they're running into? I mean, again, There have been times when I've had problems with insomnia, but largely that's because of me running on, okay, what time zone am I in?
Hmm.
Travel, all that kind of stuff that happens, right? But it's not necessarily insomnia as much as it is just the, okay, where am I? Where's my body at? Because one of the things that will tick her off is because I can hop on a plane and instantly go to sleep, or I've learned to sleep almost anywhere because if I hadn't, there are times I would have gotten none, right?
Hmm.
But again, I recognize that I don't function like most people do. So, what are
Hmm.
people coming to you for? What are the kind of the common things that people run into?
So the most common thing I hear from, well, it varies by age group. So I do see people from 15 up to, I've had patients 90 plus. I haven't had any 100-year-olds yet, but who knows? So the younger ones typically have problems falling asleep. And so they'll go to bed and they'll just lay there for hours. Or they'll realize they're not going to go to sleep until they'll get up, but then they'll be up until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And part of that is circadian rhythm. So, as you alluded to, yes, we have internal clocks, and young people, their internal clocks are often set later than the rest of the world wants it to be. So, we'll work on circadian rhythm issues, and we'll also work on, bed sleep association issues. And then as people get older, it's more that they wake up and they can't go back to sleep. But one of the universal complaints I hear from all ages is, well, I can't sleep because my mind is racing. And so that is something that we often end up tackling as well. And it's interesting because a lot of that does get resolved as we are doing the behavioral things for sleep. As I was explaining it to a patient, it's like, okay, we can't control what your mind does, but we can set things up so that it's more likely to be able to wind down, or we can kind of get around some of that anxiety through some other methods.
So, what are some of the kind of the common best practices or things that people just can do normally that would help, help getting better sleep, getting more sleep, getting through some of the common issues? What are some of
Mm-hmm.
the things you would normally recommend people try or do is developing better habits than what I have?
Yeah, so often what I will recommend at the end of the initial evaluation session is I'll have people keep sleep diaries for a couple of hours, for a couple of weeks, but then I'll be like, okay, let's just go after some of the easier stuff. So first is narrow your wake up time range to just an hour. Out there you hear to get up at the same time every single morning, but for a lot of people, especially if they have long commutes, that's not really realistic. So it's okay, maybe just have that be an hour. So you get up at 6 o'clock during the week, 7 o'clock during the weekends. For road warriors like you, of course, it's a little bit trickier. And then also on the other end, make sure you have a wind down routine that does not involve screens. And so you can watch screens up to within an hour of bedtime, but then that last hour does need to be screen free for a couple of reasons. First, screens, even though we say they're relaxing, they are stimulating, especially for workaholics who can't put their laptops down. And I saw you smart. Also, the blue light coming off our screens keeps our brain from releasing its own melatonin. And what a lot of people don't understand about melatonin is that the brain releases it all at once. And so if you're doing something to dampen that, then it's not like you're going to get another chance. And that's what tells our body that, hey, it is now time to start shifting to sleep. And plus, we're all behavioral creatures. So if we do the same set of things every night before we go to bed, the body might learn, hey, this is one of the things, or it's time to start shifting into sleep mode.
So and again, I sort of laugh because I'm better about it than I used to be. Um, Looking at things, I mean, again, I'm trying to get better about the screen habits and things like that because, again, I like to read, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that we do, right? The difference between reading from a physical book and reading from a screen is a very different experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are people going to experience the difference between the two? Because, like you say, you like to, come buy the book, read all night, and then go straight to sleep, right? But what does that mean for the difference between people that are screen readers and then e-readers?
Mhm. So yeah, there are differences. So screen readers, so for example, if you're reading on a tablet, a backlit tablet, like my mother refuses to stop reading on her iPad. And she's always up in the middle of the night unloading the dishwasher. So I'm like, okay, fine. That's what you want to do. So even though you can turn it to black background and put it on night shift, there is still enough light getting through that it's stimulating the brain. And even if you don't have any trouble falling asleep, it can still come bite you in the ass later. I have seen tens of thousands of sleep diaries at this point that tell that story. Reading on an e-reader is a little bit different as long as you have an e-reader that you can turn the light all the way down on. Like I have a Kindle Oasis, and at least the model I have, you can make all of the backlight go away, which is great. So that's fine. I'm not sure what other ones you can do that. Paperwhite, unfortunately, not quite. You can't quite make the light go away, and even though it's shining in from the side, it can still negatively impact sleep. But yeah, reading on paper, even if you have a light beside you, it's still not going to be that blue wavelength, that 420 to 480 nanometers that's going to wreck your sleep.
So before we shift into some of the other fun stuff like that, what are the things that, if nothing else, you want to tell people in terms of the importance of sleep, how to approach it? Any thoughts, like even on meditation, things like that, for some of those practices?
Yeah, meditation is a whole other
Yeah, oh, I'm well
topic.
aware. But
So,
I mean, for me, it's one of those routines I've used for a lot of years in terms of travel. It's
mhm.
the way I program myself of, okay, it's now time to shut down and do this. And there's routines I can use that most of the time will let me do that, regardless of what time zone I'm in, or where I started my day, or where I ended my day, or things like that. I mean, it's a routine that's worked for me. But what are the things that you think we ought to look at or talk about, approach, things like that?
In terms of things to incorporate into routines, or
What do you think people need to know or consider or contemplate just about their routines, how they approach everything?
how they approach everything? Yeah, that's a
One universal answer for everything.
okay. Remind, I guess, remember that every single cell in your body has its is hooked into your circadian rhythm, and it reflects your circadian rhythm. And so the more consistent you can make your circadian rhythm, the overall healthier you will be. And so that does encompass things like minimizing your wake time variability, because our circadian rhythm will often anchor, or that's typically where it anchors at wake up time. Also, managing light, getting more light earlier in the day, less blue light later, also helps feed into the circadian rhythm. And the one thing a lot that I hear from so many of my patients is that they don't eat breakfast. And so that is often one of those initial recommendations that I'll make, which is eat something within an hour of waking. Eat something, get natural light. And the eating, it doesn't have to be something big. If you're doing, for example, intermittent fasting, you can sneak in a hard boiled egg without causing an insulin spike. Or if you don't feel like eating a lot in the morning, fine. Have, like one of my patients today, she has a protein shake first thing in the morning. But, definitely something more than just your coffee and cream.
So, kind of shifting modes a little bit. One of the things that's always interesting to me is most of the writers, most of the creators I know, right? It's making a living as a creative can be hard, right? To make that kind of a living. And most people I know, we've got our day gigs, we've got the things that we do, plus all the creative work that we do, right? So for you, how do you balance the two? What's, it being both in healthcare, being a practitioner, seeing people all day long, seeing kind of all those challenges and things that come up during the day, and then approach the creative life, writing books, and getting into that side of things. How does that kind of balance and equate for you?
Yeah, that has been, I'll admit that has been a challenge during my entire creative career. And I got my first contract 10 years ago. So one thing I had to realize is that not all of the advice that is out there will work for everybody. So, for example, how many times have you heard, well, if you're going to be an author, if you're going to be a professional writer, you have to get up and write first thing in the morning? Yeah, I tried that for a long time, and my circadian rhythm is slightly later. So that absolutely did not work for me. Also, there is the advice out there that you have to write every single day, you have to be really consistent. And I've come to realize that I have a creative ebb and flow, that I'm typically way more creative and productive in that way the first half of the year. And then the second half of the year, I hit a bit of a slump. And so I've had to start paying more attention to that seasonal variation. When I'm on a deadline, like I've got that fall staff contract I've been working on, I'll often end up working and writing after dinner. So I'll typically get home and late dinner between 7 and 8, depending on if I've gone to the gym. And then I will work on creative stuff between 8 and 9, and then, 9:30, pushing it sometimes, and then screens off, and then bed between 10:30 and 11. And so it's been discovering my own rhythm and my own way of being creative that has actually made it work for me, which interestingly has meant that I have ended up tossing a lot of the advice out of the window.
So, and this is one of those things that I always like to throw out there, is this idea of what is the impact of your creative output and your creative life on your professional life? What's the value of it there? How does that affect your ability to work with patients and run your practice?
Oh, I love this. This is one of my favorite questions that nobody ever asks. So I'll give you an example. I believe that being a professional creative has helped me to be a way better psychotherapist. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a patient and she was trying to make herself do something that she had been procrastinating doing. And so I was like, okay, let's figure out how to make it fun for you. So this person likes those true crime podcasts. And so, okay, let's say that doing this thing it's going to be a podcast. So it's going to be the mystery of, blank. I think she was working on money. So it's like the mystery of the bleeding budget. Like, why is this, where are you bleeding your money? And so she came up with a concept for it. And she came up with a title for it. And so when I saw her again this past week, she said she'd make great progress. And that was what had helped her to hook her with it. So, and then she knows about my not so secret other life. She said, "You must be an author." I'm like, "Yeah, how'd you know?" So yeah, I think it helps me to be more creative with motivating people and also helping people to figure out how to make things work for them.
Well, one of the things that I always, when I'm working with people and trying to develop people and that sort of thing, is, do you have a creative outlet, right? What is it you have that kind of gives that greater meaning to life, right? I mean, because I write fiction, I do nonfiction, I do all sorts of things. I get to go play with glass and play with fire periodically. I mean, but those creative exercises, those things that I go through and do, allow me to look at things differently. It allows me to go about problem solving differently. It allows me to look at relationships differently, business relationships, how we deal with conflict and things like this, right? So for you, I mean, does it give you different ways of looking at and interacting with patients, much like the case you're talking about here, which is you look at the storytelling aspect of it, right? Because I have a firm belief that the thing that really binds most things together is our love and need for story as a species. So, are you finding that maybe sometimes telling stories is a way of connecting to people, to patients better.
Yes. And also, in psychotherapy, we talk a lot about the stories that people tell themselves and how that perpetuates problems. And so, yeah, helping people change stories and being able to do so in creative ways definitely helps them to move forward. And yeah, it does definitely helps them to connect. And then there is also a type of treatment for nightmares called imagery rehearsal therapy, where we have people record their dreams and then we have them change the story of the dream and then focus on that, which then reduces the intensity and frequency of nightmares. And so that's directly going in and changing stories. And so I love it when people come to me with nightmares because, like, okay, this is going to be fun.
So now anybody who's having nightmares, go ahead and bring them in to Anna,
Yep,
and you
we'll
cannot
change
be
them.
held, can't be held accountable. It might make its way into a book. So
Ha.
when, one of the things that for me, the act of writing has long done is allow me to look at, process situations, process things going on
Mhm.
professionally, personally. What impact from your aspect do you see that creativity has in terms of mental health, just overall?
Oh, I think it's huge. Basically, engaging in creative acts, it's a way for us to do intentionally and externally basically what our brains do when we're dreaming. Like processing through things, problem solving, working through things. So, for example, in my Ether Psychic series, when I was first writing Eros Element, I was going through my own grief process over something. And yeah, I think it was, oh, that's right. Yeah, because I had lost my beloved tuxedo cat, Bailey. And so the hero's name is Edward Bailey. So I got to memorialize him. But then also the heroine was going through her own grief process. Her father has died, but she can't tell anybody because it will, Victorian mourning and all and demands and all of that stuff. So, when you're mourning a pet, it's something that a lot of people, if they're not pet lovers, they don't understand. And so it's not really something that you can talk a lot about. But that was working through it in Eros Element really, it was really comforting and cathartic for me. So I think, something like that has made it into very many of my books.
So then is there value to people to find that creative outlet?
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of overall mental health. I mean, are there things that you would recommend people look at doing that can help?
Yeah, and it might be different of course, it's going to be different for different people. And of course, a lot of people are also going to say, but I'm not creative. How does that apply to me? And it's more of, well, what is something that you enjoy and can you make it creative? So, for example, for some people, maybe playing fantasy football is their creative outlet because, it does involve strategy and problem solving and, fantasy is in the name. So you're able to actually control what these athletes are doing rather than just yelling at them through your television screen. So, yeah, it can be, I would say, um, as my cat is trying to bat at my pen. Um, yeah, you have to be creative about finding your creative outlet. It's not necessarily drawing or painting or writing or glass blowing.
Yeah, I mean, I've told people that creative output can be as easy as cooking.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Oh,
gonna,
that's a good one.
yeah. I mean, there are a lot of ways that in the basics of life you can find different creative outlets and creative outputs that aren't necessarily I'm trying to do it as part of a commercial work. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that expression. So for you, when you look at your other not so secret personality,
Mm-hmm.
Cecelia Dominic, how do you balance the, because I mean I can, I write under a number of different names and personas and whatnot. How do you balance which you is in play at the time? And how different are the two of you?
I would say before I turned 40, the two of me were different. I think Cecelia Dominic was a bit more outgoing. She was a bit more, I don't care what people necessarily think about me personally. Of course, I care what they think about my books, but it was It was almost like an id personality. Like I didn't have to. It's like, well, it's not really me, so I can actually do what I want, not have to worry about consequences. But then, of course, since I turned 40, uh, yeah, my two personas have definitely merged. So, yeah, no, when people talk to me, they are talking to both.
So let's talk about the other part of you then, the Cecelia Dominic.
Mm-hmm.
What got you started into writing?
I have written since I was two, apparently. Like, according to my mother, I dictated a story to her when I was two. And apparently it was about a bunny. And what it lacked in plot and character development, it more than made up for in enthusiasm. I have yet to actually see this story, but apparently that's when I started. And I wrote like all the way through like grade school, high school, college. Creative writing has always been my escape, my go-to, my fun. And you remember, you're a little bit older than I am, but like remember in elementary school to learn the letters, they had the blank spot on the top of the brown pieces of paper for the picture that you could draw, and then the lines for the letters underneath it. I loved those things because I love both drawing and writing.
Yes, back in my day, we would pull out the papyrus and
Okay, well, that's what I thought you were just, having to, early chiseling lessons.
yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that was really hard to erase that off the stone. Uh,
Yeah.
so, at what point did you decide to go from creative writing as a creative outlet then to trying to sell work?
It was when I was in grad school, and I had encountered one of those sort of career direction changing setbacks. And I was in a bookstore doing some retail therapy, and I came across an issue of Writer's Digest. And of course, when you're in graduate school, you're trying to do research articles and get those published. And so I picked up Writer's Digest and I looked through it and I was like, holy crap, people actually get paid to write? Mind blown. What? So that's when I started trying to sell short stories. And didn't really have much luck for several years because, even though I'd written short stories my entire life, still had a lot to learn. But eventually I did. I won a short story contest in 2010 from a small publisher. They didn't end up wanting the book I sent them. I actually finished my first novel in 2004-ish, I think. And that was one that ended up getting me my first book contract almost 9 years later after many, 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 many revisions.
So, you got to learn to love rejection.
Yes.
How do you go about learning to love rejection? Because that's part of the key of being a writer,
Mm-hmm.
being an artist, is that idea of a lot of the time getting that sale is right place, right time after having thrown a lot of things at the wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of it is definitely appreciating that so much of it is out of your control. Like one of the reasons I got my first book contract is because it's set in the Ozark Mountains, and that is where my editor was based. And she hadn't seen any books set in the Ozark Mountains. I mean, she also liked the rest of the book, but it was really the setting that made her interested. I guess made her interested to read all of it. And yeah, you just never know. So, I mean, I also believe like when I'm in my critique group and they're giving me feedback, and some of it is, not positive feedback. I'm like, okay, thanks, guys, because I'd rather hear it from you than from, an Amazon reviewer or from an editor. And I guess it's perspective because it's like, once you've been through a dissertation defense, you got a really high bar for what sucks. And it's also just like, okay, um, emotion regulation. Yeah, it sucks in the moment. Let it go, move on, try again, gamify it. That often helps. I'm not recommending that you pay for your bathroom with the rejections because I think that would probably be not great for your mental health. But it's like, okay, after 10, I get to go buy a piece of cake. It's like a punch card.
On your 10th rejection, you get to go satisfy yourself with unhealthy food.
Exactly.
Well, that being the case, looking at over time, I mean, this is one of those things that it fundamentally becomes a thing of the act of writing has to be a reward into and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if once you make that decision, you want to start sharing it with people, right? That can be one of the most terrifying things that anybody can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the list of great fears, public speaking is on the top of that list. One of those things that to me has always kind of been that is that movement between I'm going to write something and now I'm going to publish it. What are people going to think about it? What are people going to say about it? So how do you handle both good and bad feedback once a book hits the world?
Mm. Yeah, no, I will admit that the negative reviews sting a little bit, but I'm not one who's going to go and avoid them because sometimes they do make good points and they do offer areas for improvement. So again, it's putting it in perspective. Like, okay, this is subjective feedback. Often, when people are writing reviews, I'm like, did you really actually read the book that I wrote? And sometimes it's been helpful. Like I got, when Aristotle meant their first edition, people complained that it started too slowly. So I went through and cut a bunch from the front. And, it didn't hurt the story. Kind of didn't really make the prequel novella hook in as well, but oh well. And, it overall improved the product. I mean, I think that's one of the advantages we have as independent publishers is that if we're getting the same negative feedback over and over and over again, then we can actually go in and fix it fairly easily rather than if we were traditionally published, where you have to go through the process and the layers and the approval and all of that stuff.
So looking at kind of the great scheme of life and looking at all the moving pieces and everything else, what are the things that you have found the most rewarding about writing and creativity?
Well, I will have to admit that I love it when people come up to me and tell me how much they love my books. That's like somebody actually fangirled over me at Dragon Con, and I was like, holy cow, this is amazing. Took me 10 years to get there, but I finally got fangirled. Um, yeah. So, it's where I find that, externally that people have read my books and it's made a difference for them. Like actually one of my early Dragon Cons, it was the year that the alt history track ended up being over in the America's Mart because the whatever the hell it's called now was under construction. And yeah, and somebody came up to me and said, the lycanthropy files is like those are my go-tos. Like just when I need to escape, it's like I have read that series so many times. And I'm like, oh, yay, my books help somebody to, do what books have done for me, which is to escape, which is, it's given me comfort. Um, Internally, I love it when I'm writing and my brain drops something in there. And I'm like, I don't know what the purpose of that is, but we'll just leave it in there. And if it doesn't make sense later, we'll take it out. And then invariably, even if it's in maybe another book, my brain, that it makes sense. And I'm like, oh, thank you, brain. That's, just that creative magic when that happens. Or like when I'm in that creative flow and the words are just coming and it's more like I'm just writing what I'm witnessing rather than it feeling like I'm generating it myself. That's almost like a channeling experience. That's also really super rewarding.
So what's your latest series? Let's talk to everybody about that, what they need to go pick up and be added to that to be read pile. So what is your latest series?
The latest series, the one that I just finished, is the Fae Files. And so in it, an exiled Fae princess has one chance to return home. She has to solve a mystery at the Center for Paranormal Disease Control. However, as we all know, Fae bargains are loaded with tricks. So it's not going to be that easy.
So where do people need to start and who are they going to be hanging out with in that series?
They need to start with book one, The Shadow Project. They're going to immediately meet Reyna, who is our exiled Fae princess. Oh, you'll like this. So she and her brother were exiled after spying on the Battle of Culloden. And so it's been a while. And so she's been living among the humans. And so through the series, she's trying to figure out, okay, how much of me is still Fae? How much of me has been influenced by the humans? Do I really have Fae morality? And then there is also a love interest who is a gargoyle, Lawrence, and his father was killed by a Fae, and so he's made it his life's work. He's also a veterinarian, but he's been studying the Fae to see if he can figure out who killed his father, and so he considers himself an expert. So in the first book, they're butting heads because he basically he face blames her, which really pisses her off. And so it's humor, it's mystery, it's thriller, it's definitely urban fantasy, and it's set here in Atlanta.
So before we wrap stuff up, you've got a series of workshops coming up.
Mm-hmm.
What are they, and how can people find out more about them?
Yes, thank you. So this is through Psych Up Academy. I will be speaking as part of a few seminars coming up. There's a mindset seminar coming up in about a little over a week. And you can find out more about that on my LinkedIn. Also speaking as part of the Alliance for Independent Authors, and then another a seminar workshop that's as part of a different writing organization. But if you are not a member of any of those, you want to make it easy, you can come to my Direct to You workshop on October 18th. It's called Punch Through Procrastination. Stop beating yourself up and start living your fulfilling creative and other projects. So that will be October 18th at 2:00. And I will give you the registration link for the show notes.
Excellent. So what have we not hit on today that you think we need to talk about a little bit?
Well, I have definitely been, as part of my creative work personally and also professionally, really looking into procrastination, because that's something that so many writers struggle with. And
don't you know that part of writing means you're sitting there going down a research rabbit hole that you're never going to use any of that information?
Yeah, that is definitely part of the process. However, if that ends up being your whole process, you've got a problem. But yeah, and people think procrastination is just like this very simple surface level behavior, but now that I've been giving procrastination talks to writers actually for over 10 years now. Started back with the Georgia romance writers, and then it ended up being an even better research chapter in Better Sleep for the Overachiever, which is one of my nonfiction books. And then, I turned it into a workshop and then an entire course. And so, I've mentioned the importance of knowing what rules work for you, flexibility. And so that's basically my point with it, is that, a lot of the advice out there makes a lot of incorrect assumptions, including that there is a system that will work for everyone. And so what I teach people to do is to first identify the tools that work for them, and then create a system that is both flexible and built on self-compassion. Because let's be honest, the more we beat ourselves up for procrastinating, the more we do it. It doesn't help.
Well, Anna, I'm glad we finally got to do part 1. We're going to have to come back and do a part 2 and just talk about procrastination one of these
Definitely.
days. We've only been putting this off for a year, so we can put that one off for another week or 2.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, you can just fuss at my husband in the bar for difficulty scheduling again.
Well, if that's what it takes, is to make him buy us a drink every time you write. But where can people find you professionally, and where can they find your Cecelia Dominic you?
All right, so professionally, they can find me at Atlanta Insomnia Behavioral Health Services. And if you have sleep problems and are in the United States, we do have almost 3 SIPAC providers, which means that we can do telehealth with people across state lines, as long as they're in a SIPAC state, which is now most of them. And that website is sleepyinvatl.com. You can find more about me and my books at ceciliadominic.com. And that's CECILIA Dominic.com. And then as for my procrastination stuff, you can find me at, I'm trying to remember sorry, I should have looked up the link. I believe it is, you can join the email list and take the What Kind of Procrastinator Are You quiz at bit.ly/, I believe it's procrastination hyphen podcast, but I will double check that and give it to you for your show notes.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you came out to hang out with me for an afternoon.
Yes,
And
thank you.
be good to see you again in person really soon. And other
Yep.
than that, I think it's time for me to go take a nap.
All right. Yeah, that's a little close to bedtime, but you do you.
And until next week, this has been Creating Pros. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks. Bye.